Shalom Havarim and hello friends. It is good to see you on this Sunday morning or whenever it is you're watching. I was told last week by Sonia's uncle that when I tell my jokes, I have these are his words, a bedpan face. Not deadpan, a bedpan face. So I'm going to try to be a little more expressive this morning for Tim. All right, Uncle Tim, no more bedpan face. All right, so the story this morning comes from an extra biblical source. This is not a story you'll find in the Bible, but it's a different story of how the Ten Commandments came into being. The story is told that first Moses went to the Canaanites. And Moses said to the Canaanites, he said, "Hey, would you like a commandment from God?" And the Canaanites said, "What commandment?" And Moses said, "Honor thy father and thy mother." And the Canaanites said, "You know what? We're good right now. No, thank you. You can just keep that commandment." So Moses then goes to the Perizzites, and he says to the Perizzites, "Would you like a commandment from God?" And the Perizzites say, "Which commandment?" And Moses says, "Thou shalt not steal." The Perizzites thought for a little bit. They're like, nah, we're good here. Thanks, but no thanks. You can keep your commandment from God. Moses finally went to the Mennonites. And Moses said to the Mennonites, "Would you like a command from God?" And the Mennonites said, "How much is it going to cost?" And Moses thought about it a second, and he's like, "Well, it's free." And the Mennonites said, "We'll take 10. All right, so Mennonites are cheap if you haven't picked up on that. Today we are talking about the Ten Commandments, and I don't have the chance to really get into each of these commandments. I'm sure you've probably heard these commandments before. I'm going to be preaching from the Exodus 20 passage, and rather than going into discussion on each of these commandments, I want to kind of give some overarching story behind it and reason why I think this is applicable today just as much as it was back when Moses first shared these words of God with the people at Mount Sinai. Now, I start though this morning just with some questions. I'm wondering, how many times have you heard somebody say something like, "These aren't called the 10 suggestions"? Usually it's with a little bit more sass, and down here in the South, you hear, "They ain't called the 10 suggestions." I know I've heard that because I've said that, and I probably sounded like that too. "It ain't called the 10 suggestions." Well, you know who doesn't call them the 10 Commandments? The Bible doesn't call them the 10 Commandments. That's actually a name that we give to these commandments from God. It's actually, the Hebrew people refer to this as the Aseret HaDivrot. All right, practice that one. Impress your friends around the water cooler if you ever get back to work. The Aseret HaDivrot. The 10 words. Literally the 10 words. And they get this from verse 1 in Exodus chapter 20. Verse 1 simply says, "And God spoke all these words." Now, if you really want to sound impressive and you can't remember Aseret HaDivrot, many scholars will refer to this passage as the Decalogue. Deca means 10, logos for words, 10 words. But even that is debatable. How many of these are there? Because you can divide these up in different ways. For instance, one of the last lines in the Decalogue or the Aseret HaDivrot says to not covet your neighbor's house. And don't covet your neighbor's wife. Don't covet your neighbor's servant. And don't covet your neighbor's donkey. Don't covet your neighbor's ox. How we divide this up affects how many we would say there are. So it's really easy. You could say that there were 10, 12, 14, even different commandments. So which is it? How are we to refer to these words of God? Honestly, I don't think God cares. I don't think God cares how we refer to them. I think what God really cares about is that we live by them. Now, just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to call them the Ten Commandments because that's what most people refer to them as. But just know it's not always as straightforward as it looks or sounds. All right, so the Ten Commandments are really interesting to me because if you read through the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, you will find a total of 613 commandments. 613. And I've heard other pastors say this before. It's helpful to think of it. I mean, how many people can remember 613 commandments? So God, being full of grace and mercy, said, hey, if you can't remember 613, just remember these 10. I think God knows that we're going to have even problems with that. So God eventually comes along and says, hey, if you can't remember these 10, at least remember these 2. Love God and love your neighbor. So there's this distillation process, this boiling down. 613, well, all 613 can kind of be condensed into these 10, and all 10 can be condensed into these 2. And if you read through the 10 Commandments, I encourage you to do that this week. Read through Exodus 20 and just think about, is this about loving God? Is this about loving your neighbor? Some can kind of fit into both categories. But it's always about those 2 commandments, loving God and loving your neighbor. So far so good, right? This hasn't been too contentious. Well, this is where things start to get a little bit tricky. I want to ask you, who is supposed to follow the 10 Commandments? And I know on the surface level that's an easy question. You're like, of course we're supposed to follow the 10 Commandments. But follow me here. It's a little more tricky than that. It's not as easy as you might think. And I want to ask the question, why do we as Christians not always follow all 613 commandments from God? Why do we think that these 10 apply to us, but not the 603 others? And I come to this question because I remember many years ago, I was in a class and we had a guest speaker who was a Hebrew professor at a different school, at a different university. And he came and he talked to us about the 10 Commandments. And he went through, one by one, and he was talking about the Sabbath day rest. And he kind of said something just off the side, it wasn't the focus of his comments. But he said, these aren't made for you. He knew that we were a bunch of Christians. He was speaking to a Christian group. He said, these aren't meant for you. These are meant for us. He, as a Jewish person, said, those aren't for us, they're for him. Now, we thought he was joking, and many people in the class giggled, they laughed, and he's like, I don't, speaking of a bedpan face, he's like, I don't know why you're laughing. I didn't tell a joke. It's like, this isn't for you. This is meant for just us Jews. And the reason he arrives at that is, think about who Moses is addressing. Moses has just come down from Mount Sinai. He receives this word from God, and he's speaking to the Hebrew people. They're gathered there, and he's telling them these 10 different commandments from God. So this Hebrew professor was saying, y'all weren't there. This wasn't commanded of you. This was commanded of me and my people for generations to come. So let's keep going with that line of thinking here. And also look at these commandments from God. When you think about who is gathered there and you read this text closely, you'll notice that Moses is just addressing the men as well. Because there's some of these commandments, he says things like, don't covet your neighbor's wife. Now, if he was trying to address both men and women, wouldn't it make sense that he would say, don't covet your neighbor's wife if you're a man, or for the ladies, don't covet your neighbor's husband. But if you look at these commandments, it's very much aimed toward the male population. And that's just the way things were done in those days. It was a very hierarchical, patriarchal system. So do you think that these 10 commandments, do they apply to Hebrew women? Well, if Moses wasn't directly addressing them, you might say, no, this was just meant for the Hebrew men. This is the group to which Moses is speaking. Have you ever heard anybody say that the 10 Commandments are only for Hebrew men? No. Just because Moses doesn't directly address the Hebrew women doesn't mean that these don't apply to them as well. And likewise, just because Christians weren't there, weren't going to come along for some time, for several thousand years, just because Christians weren't there doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to us as well. So let's keep going with this. If this applies to both non-Jewish people and Jewish people, these 10 commandments, why do not all 613 commandments found in the Old Testament apply to us today? I always think that we need to go back to ask the question of what is the purpose of these teachings? What is the purpose of this law? What is the purpose of this commandment? For instance, there's this one passage in the Old Testament that talks about when you harvest the wheat from your field, make sure to leave the corners unharvested. Okay. How many of you out there who consider yourselves to be followers of Jesus Christ and strong Christians, how many of you left the wheat in the corner of your fields this year? I didn't put out wheat this year. Maybe you did. I don't know. What's the purpose of this commandment? Well, you go on in that commandment, it says, leave the wheat in the corner of the fields so that the widows and the orphans and the strangers among you can come and harvest that and have food. This was their only way to provide for themselves. So the purpose of that commandment comes down to one of those two main commandments, to love God, and this one was specifically to love your neighbor. Leaving that wheat in the field so that your neighbor could come through in their moment of need and have something to eat throughout the winter. So I would like to say that sometimes when you read these Old Testament laws, the law itself, the specific way to live that out, maybe doesn't apply to everybody today, but the principle behind it is just as relevant today as it was all those years ago. So we are still called to love God and to love our neighbor. And likewise, when you read through these old the 10 Commandments, these are just as relevant as well. They're more principles than specific teachings. It's just as relevant for today as it was back then, because it was good for the Jewish men, the Hebrew men, as they gathered there hearing Moses give these rules and commandments. It was good for the men, the Jewish men, so it was also good for the Jewish women. It was good for the Jewish men, so it was also good for us Christians who come along years later. Now let me take it one more step. If it's good for us Christians, is it also good for non-Christians? And the reason I ask that question is because I don't think that God has different expectations of Christians and non-Christians. I don't think God has different did I say expectations? I didn't want to say expectations. I don't think God has different requirements of Christians and non-Christians. I don't think that God has different expectations of different people. I keep saying expectations. I'm ruining where I'm going. I do think that God has different expectations of whether or not Christians and non-Christians will live in the same way. But God still wants us to follow these commandments, whether we call ourselves Christians or not. It's still good to love God and love your neighbor. The purpose of those teachings still apply, no matter where you are and what you consider yourself to be. Now, I think the challenge is that we can't expect a non-Christian to follow the teachings of Jesus just because Jesus said to do something. And yes, Jesus affirms multiple times in the New Testament that we are called to love God and to love our neighbor. But for a person that doesn't follow Jesus or doesn't believe him to have authority, how can we show them that this is indeed the best way to live? Well, I think the best way to show someone else is to actually live it out ourselves. For us to love God and to love our neighbor, for us to follow even the 10 Commandments, to show them that yes, this principle still applies today. And when you choose to love God and love your neighbor, everyone benefits from that. My prayer for us is that we as followers of Jesus, we as Christians, will do just that we will follow these commandments to love God and to love our neighbor. And in doing so, those around us will see that the world is made a better place through us. More specifically, the world is made a better place by God acting through us. Our communities are better when we help and serve those around us. Our nation grows stronger when we choose to love God and love our neighbors. I am thoroughly committed and convinced that this applies to everyone. Whether you call yourself a Christian or not, the world is a better place when you follow the commandments of God. May we all choose this week to love God, to love our neighbors, to follow, if not the 613 commandments, at least the top 10, the 10 commandments, the Aseret HaDabrot, the Decalogue, whatever you want to call it. And if you can't remember all of those, just remember, it all boils down to 2 points. Love God and love your neighbor. All right, friends, have a great week.